today we have a fourth session of our series of workshops on peace, rethinking peace. So today the topic is peace in Japanese philosophy, and Nils Weidmann will introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. So Nils Weidmann is, I will just say in one sentence, is the director of the College of Fellows, Center for Interdisciplinary and Intercultural Studies from the University of Tübingen. So please, Nils, the floor is yours.
Thank you a lot, Veronica, for giving me the opportunity to participate in this workshop and introduce today's speakers. And welcome to the speakers and to everyone else participating in this session. I'm very happy that Veronica is organizing these series of workshops. I think it's the third one now that are taking place, or even the fourth one already, the fourth one taking place on rethinking peace, which is a very nice initiative. I'm also very happy you asked me, Veronica, to moderate this session, as I'm particularly interested in Japanese philosophy. And I'm very honored to introduce our Japanese colleagues to the audience. We agreed to discuss each paper after presentation and then go on with the next paper, rather than listening to all the papers and have a general discussion at the end. And we do have a total of 2 hours time. So let me start. We have a program. We start with Nagasaka Masumi, go on with Ishikawa Motomu, and then with the paper by Katsumori Makoto. Let me briefly introduce Nagasaka Masumi to you. She is a professor at Waseda University, and Professor Nagasaka, you are investigating German and French phenomenology by situating it in the history of European philosophy. Your doctoral thesis inquired about faith in mistrust, Derrida's possibility of the impossibility in his reading of Husserl, Heidegger, and Levinas. Nagasaka Masumi is author of numerous articles, including, I just mentioned, few, Verticality, Two Sorts of Multiplicity in Bergson and Levinas. And then another one, Levinas and his transformation of the concept of experience, the inversion of consciousness as anarchic derangement, and finally, Levinas and Merleau-Ponty, Body and World. So welcome to today's workshop. And the title of your presentation is Tanabe and Levinas on Me-ontology, the autonomy of self-criticism for the heteronomy of the ethics of the other. Floor is yours, please.
Thank you for introducing me. May I start? I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry. May I start?
Please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Please.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Veronica Chibotal for organizing this conference, and also I'd like to thank everyone who has gathered online to participate in this event. And yeah, so thank you. I would like to begin by briefly introducing myself and explaining why I'm speaking at this event today. So I am a specialist in German, as was mentioned. I am a specialist in German and French phenomenology, and my main areas of interest are European philosophy, Husserl, Heidegger, Levinas, Derrida, Marc Grissier, etc. And I unfortunately, I am not a specialist in Japanese philosophy, but as this workshop is dedicated to Japanese philosophy, I would like to focus on the philosophy of Hajime Tanabe, a contemporary of Levinas, and who can be placed in a parallel with Levinas, since he also studied at the University of Freiburg in the 1920s, where not only Husserl, but also young Heidegger taught. And Tanabe was strongly influenced by Heidegger, and after his return to Japan, he discovered or he developed his own philosophy by criticizing Heidegger's philosophy. And secondly, I would like to explain why I chose Levinas and Tanabe as the topic for this event. I was asked to talk about the concept of peace in Japanese philosophy, and peace is an European concept, and it's translated into Japanese as heiwa. And according to a Japanese dictionary, the term heiwa did not originally mean peace in the European sense, but when Japan opened up to the world and when hundreds and thousands of European concepts were introduced to Japan, Japanese scholars needed a term that could convey the European concept of peace. And so the term heiwa began to be used as a word that reflects the European concept of peace, that is, the absence of war between countries as opposed to war. And according to the same dictionary, however, the word heiwa originally referred to a different phenomenon. So this word is composed of hei and wa, heiwa, where hei means equalization of different levels, and wa means harmony. So today I would like to focus on the first meaning of equalization, equalize, which especially refers to the equalization in the relationship between the I and the other. So, and for this reason, I have chosen the topic of Genso Echo from Tanabe's concept. It's that I will tentatively translate as a return or recurrence, meaning returning to the other. And I find it interesting that concept of recurrence can also be found in Levinas philosophy. And we can assume that this term has the potential to open up a dialogue between the philosophies of Levinas and Tanabe. So now I would like to share the screen, and I would like to begin reading my presentation. So just wait for a moment, I will share the screen with you. So this is my non-published paper, and I hope after the discussion, I hope to be able to publish this paper. So Tanabe and Levinas on meta-ontology, the autonomy of the self-criticism, qua the heteronomy of the ethics of the other. So introduction. 6 years before Levinas moved to Freiburg in 1928, the Japanese student Hajime Tanabe was learning phenomenology from Husserl under the tutelage of young Heidegger in the small city on the slope of the Black Forest. After his return to Japan, Tanabe introduced his own philosophical system, which he developed in series of articles, Logic of Species, published in the early 1930s, and while reconstructing the concept of absolute nothingness of his teacher Kitaro Nishida, Tanabe criticized Heidegger's thought as a philosophy of being and opposed it to his own philosophy of death in his dialectics of death and resurrection. I do not wish to diminish the stark differences between Tanabe's and Levinas' thoughts. Both pursued their own philosophical agendas, which drove them in quite different directions. However, although neither one was aware of the work of the other, we find a profound intersection in their thinking on the crucial question of the totality of being and its meta-ontological exteriority. Our main reference to Tanabe's work in his book is his book Philosophy as Metanoetics, published in 1946, which consists of lecture notes from the World War II period. This book is of primary interest because of Tanabe's critical re-examination of his own early philosophy, regarded as a self-contained system, and his attempt to accomplish its self-critical deconstruction. In this context, Tanabe directs his thinking toward the other power. The term other power, tariki, comes from Pure Land Zen Buddhism, which sees the self's own efforts at salvation, self-power, jiriki, as insufficient and places faith in saving power of Amida Buddha. Although Tanabe borrows this term from Zen, he uses it in his own way. For Tanabe, other power means a heteronomous power that arises in the midst of self-criticism when a person recognizes his or her sinful nature. Thus, the heteronomy signifies the impossibility for the I to rely upon its self-power or maintain its autonomy. Tanabe's introduction of the term metanoesis as the activity of conversion and transformation performed by other power designates the important switch from autonomy to heteronomy. Tanabe's use of the term zangedo means both the way of metanoesis, or the way of repentance, as well as metanoetics, that is, transcending of knowing, or in a larger sense, the transcending of the metaphysical philosophy based on contemplation or intellectual intuition achieved by the use of reason. This is quotation. So the switch from self-founded system to heteronomous openness through self-criticism is a focal point of our study, as well as the point of intersection in our philosophers. We will explore this transition through the interplay of the I and the other, as well as through the key notion of pardon and self-sacrifice common to both Tanabe and Levinas. Self-criticism as shame. So, 1. Tanabe on self-criticism as shame. Tanabe, like Levinas, pushes his philosophy to the limits of knowledge, where it collides with religion. However, yes?
ここから見る
いいよ。
大丈夫あんまり読めないでしょ
大体読む。
Okay. Yeah, thank you. However, their critical engagement with Western thought does not differ to any established religious doctrines. Rather, it reveals that the inherent critical potential of philosophy to exceed the autonomy of rationality is necessary for philosophy itself. For Tanabe, the conversion to death and resurrection of philosophy should be considered as the mediation of absolute nothingness into relative being. Given that nothingness can be exterior to the totality of being, exteriority must be thought of in a meta-ontological way as affecting the totality of beings, but not as the cause or origin of being, because otherwise nothing ceases to be nothing. Only such an absolute nothingness avoids falling into a mysticism or dogmatism that presupposes a non-philosophical premise. For Tanabe, metanoetics, as a sort of criticism, can only be experienced as shame. Here, Tanabe is inspired by Sinran, who uses the metanoesis in a combination with the piercing shame, zangi, such that the two are necessarily bound together due to what Tanabe calls the permanent ineffectiveness of self-power. To summarize, Tanabe's metanoesis is a disruption that emerges from the core of philosophy and from philosophy's very enactment of itself. This disruption is also the source of philosophy's resurrection. A philosophical aporia is the way without a way, opened up by other power. In the absolute self-criticism of autonomous philosophy, metanoetics first announces itself in the experience of shame. 2. Self-criticism and shame in Levinas' notion of knowledge. This sort of questioning resonates with Levinas when he states, knowing becomes knowing of a fact only if it is at the same time critical, if it puts itself into question, goes back beyond its origin. End of quote. This Levinasian self-criticism is never sure of itself. It is a kind of regressive inquiry, which always demands a permanent questioning on the origin of knowledge. And Levinas introduces in Totality and Infinity two kinds of self-criticism. On the one hand, self-criticism as a discovery of one's weakness, that is a consciousness of a failure, and on the other hand, self-criticism as a discovery of one's unworthiness, that is a consciousness of guilt. Claiming that European thought has a tradition of taking critique as a consciousness of failure rather than a consciousness of guilt, he sees the consciousness of failure as a mere relative self-criticism that presupposes an area in which critique itself is safe from further critique. He writes, I quote, "The critique of spontaneity engendered by failure implies then a power to reflect on its failure and on the totality," end quote. Levinas opposes this power to the second kind of critique carried out in the consciousness of guilt, which reflects not my subordination to the facts, but to the other, to the infinite, quote. In guilt, the notion of my power is called into question. I quote, "Consciousness welcomes the other. It is the revelation of a resistance to my powers that does not counter them as a greater force, but calls in question the naive right of my powers, my glorious spontaneity as a living being." Levinas regards this second type of self-criticism as the experience of shame, noting that the consciousness of guilt is not a theoretical consideration, but is accomplished as shame. To sacrifice and pardon. Replacing one with another, and Tanabe's dialectics as forgiveness. So Tanabe's metanoetics is elaborated as dialectics, which is a very special kind because it does not suppose any ideal or goal. It is merely a continual movement that never resolves into a synthesis. I quote Tanabe, "Here, dialectical unity is both an unity and an opposition. It is not the sort of unity that brings contradictions into synthesis by way of negation and sublation, but a unity that leaves contradictions just as they are. Contradictory opposites are never abrogated. Rather, because the subject dies in the depth of the contradiction, the opposition ceases to be an opposition. In this dialectical movement of two contradictory terms, the contradiction is far from being resolved. Only after the subject who observes the contradictory terms renounces the possibility for resolution do the term lose their opposing powers." Tanabe presents this as a neither nor situation in which both self and contradiction cease to be contradictory opposites. End of quote. It is not the simple fusion of two terms, rather it is the renunciation of the self by itself, since it is precisely self-power that provides the opposing terms with their conflicting potential. And Tanabe makes similar points when he speaks of love, a forgiving evil. Here, we deal with the opposition of evil and innocence. In forgiveness, evil does not lose its essential properties, but rather its power of opposition toward innocence. I quote, "The opposition remains, but evil loses its power to oppose," end of quote. The negation of negation, because it is negated and this negation itself is negated, does not mean extinguishing negation or embracing it in some sort of unity. Otherwise, there would be an all-encompassing unity of being. In contrast, a unity of nothingness does not dismiss the opposition of two terms, but merely detaches them from the self-power of the self. We are now left with the question of how the self enters into relation with absolute nothingness, since absolute nothingness is by definition not a relative being. And absolute nothingness is never given for Tanabe as an object of intuition. If other power were the object of an intuition, Tanabe's philosophy would turn into a totalizing dogmatism, which presupposes some existing exteriority as a premise for salvation. Instead, his absolute critique marks a rupture with being and with any kind of immediate intuition. I quote, "The self-awakening of nothingness is not a self-awakening of the fact that myself exists, but an action witness of the fact that myself does not exist. In other words, the self does not encounter other power as the saving grace of a greater being. Rather, the self attests its own nullification as a rupture in its own totality in experiences such as forgiving. To explain this paradox of this nullification, Tanabe introduces a term from Buddhism, Genjo, often translated as actualization. In his personal philosophical account of Shobogenzo, Tanabe interprets Genjo through the work of the 13th century Zen scholar Dogen, who opposes Genjo to Tongo Chokaku, or immediate intuition. Tanabe interprets Genjo as an actualization without being intuited of absolute nothingness that occurs only by the mediation of relative beings. As Tanabe explains, action, I quote, "action means absolute nothingness emerges to work in such a way that being is converted into nothingness and nothingness into being," end quote. Absolute nothingness cannot be the object of intuition. Its trace is only seen indirectly in the relation between relative beings in the dialectic movement of forgiving love. Thus, Tanabe has never supposed that absolute nothingness can be experienced as an object of immediate intuition. Rather, this paradoxical experience is only possible through the mediation of relative beings. Absolute nothingness cannot work apart from the transformation among relative beings. End of quote. Here, Tanabe is inspired by the Buddhist concept of twofold transferring equal between this world and Pure Land, which consists of going to the Pure Land, also equal, and returning or recurrence from the Pure Land to save the other people. Again, so equal. Tanabe refers to Dogen, who observes that Bodhisattva's role consists in a compassion that seeks to lead others to nirvana rather than attain it oneself. Based on this reference, Tanabe concludes, saving oneself means performing an act of absolute self-negation, and the self-negation is only brought fully to consciousness when one can sacrifice one's own self compassionately for the sake of others. Just as the experience of absolute nothingness is always an experience mediated through relative beings, so too the repentant act of absolute self-negation is the compassionate opening of the self to the suffering of others. In other words, the absolute relative relationship has to be mediated by relative relationship, in which one relative being fulfills a mediating role in the salvation of other relative beings. Tanabe interprets the return or recurrence from the Pure Land to this world not as the return to the same self, but as the transformation that indicates a replacement of the one's autonomous subjectivity with another. The autonomous I is replaced by another I resurrected by other power, which is to say, saved through a sacrifice on behalf of another relative being. And replacing one with another in Levinas's notion of pardon and substitution. The experience of forgiveness as self-renouncement that we have seen in the beginning of the precedent paragraph reminds us of the Levinasian concept of forgiveness or pardon. I quote Levinas, "active in a stronger sense than forgetting, which does not concern the reality of the event forgotten, pardon acts upon the past, purifying it. But in addition, forgetting nullifies the relations with the past, whereas pardon conserves the past pardoned in the purified present," end of quote. Pardon is not a forgetting, Therefore, it is not a nullification of the past in which the committed sin opposed to the innocence resolves its opposition to the innocence. On the contrary, pardon preserves in itself what happened in the past and deals with the renouncement of the I instead of overcoming of the sin. A similar analysis could be found in Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence concerning the notion of the recurrence of the subjectivity through substitution for another. The subject, I quote, subjectivity of the subject is persecution and martyrdom. It is a recurrence, which is not self-consciousness, in which the subject would still be maintained distinct from itself in non-indifference, would still remain somehow in itself. It is a recurrence on the side of oneself prior to indifference to itself, and it is a substitution for another. End of quote. The recurrence is thus quite different from either a synthesis or following of an effect after its cause, which both presuppose the autonomous I. Here, we are dealing with something different from a cause and effect relation, something that affects the self from its anarchy. Levin's notion of anarchy means that absolute alterity is not immediately given. This notion allows to absolute alterity a way of concerning me without entering into conjunction with me. Such a relation involves another Levinasian notion, that of laity, the attribution of the third person he or il in French, which designates the way in which the otherness remains always outside of the direct relations with me, thus creating a lateral relationship unconvertible into rightness. And through laity, the trace of the anarchic presents itself in the face of the other. As Levinas concludes, theology begins in the face of one's fellow man. The divinity of God is exhausted in the human. Oh, I hope I can read the conclusion, but it may already time.
Sure, go on, please.
Thank you.
The conclusion.
Yeah. Conclusion. Despite the major differences between Levinas and Tanabe in the way they develop the above-mentioned topics, both thinkers tend to depict the act of forgiveness as the nullification of the self and the return or recurrence of the I by the means of the meta-ontological structure of an affection that escapes immediate intuition. Both thinkers speak of a return or recurrence of the subject through relations with others. For Tanabe, absolute nothingness works only through the mediation of relative beings, resulting in the replacement of the autonomous I with a heteronymous one. For Levinas too, the subject returns to the one different from itself only via the sacrificial substitution of the self for the other. Therefore, the two thinkers converge in their exposition on something other than being, existing outside of the totality of subjectivity. For Levinas, anarchy. For Tanabe, absolute nothingness. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this nice presentation. I think it's been pretty clear, and we do have some time for questions and discussion. So please, if you now raise your hand. Okay. Yeah, Veronica, please, you go first.
Yeah, thank you, Masumi. It was really fascinating. Like I would have two questions. First, yeah, you mentioned this notion of conscious and consciousness in relationship to the other in Levinas. And I mean, as you know, conscious and consciousness are two different concepts in English. Yeah, like conscious is like moral conscious, and consciousness can be something more like theoretical. But in French, there is no such a distinction. So would you say, so that's really like a more technical question for Levinas. I'm wondering myself, I always wondered, when he speaks about like conscious or consciousness, conscience, which is made possible through the relationship to the other, does he speak of moral conscious, of consciousness, or would you say that this distinction doesn't make any sense anymore in Levinas. So this would be my first question. And then I find this very interesting, like this idea that you could relate Tanabe and Levinas to this concept of something else than being, other than being. And why not affirming, arguing simply that this other than being or beyond being is simply the same as nothingness. It's another way of talking about nothingness. And then we would have like a very beautiful dialogue between like Japanese and European philosophy, because nothingness is like a very important concept in Japanese philosophy in general.
Oh, thank you, Veronica, for your two questions, and both of them are very important, I think. So regarding the first question, of course, Levinas was writing in French, and in French, there is only one term for English consciousness and conscience. So conscience. So there's no, how to say, Levinas, of course, uses this term knowing that this term can signify two meanings. The consciousness as a subject of the knowledge or cognition, and conscience. It means a moral feeling. And so this is why for him the self-criticism can be how to say described in two levels. The first level is just the self-criticism in a theoretical way. So this is a relative criticism, self-criticism, which is relative because it is just a partial criticism. There is the I, which is not criticized and remaining the same in this criticism. But there is a second level of the criticism, which is a moral criticism of the self. And so the two meanings of conscience in French. So on the one hand, consciousness, on the other hand, conscience. These two meanings are, how to say, signify for Levinas two levels of self-criticism. So the theoretical self-criticism, if it is a theoretical self-criticism, remains in the partial self-criticism. But if it radicalizes itself, it will become a moral self-criticism, because it means in the moral self-criticism, the I has no place safe from the criticism itself. Yeah. So for Levinas, there's no discontinuity between the theoretical consciousness and the moral consciousness. Yeah. And for the second question, yeah, so Tanabe criticizes his teacher's notion of absolute nothingness, because for his teacher, so Kitaro Nishida, nothingness, absolute nothingness is described as if it is an object of intuition, at least for Tanabe. So, and for Tanabe, he tries to avoid to say that absolute nothingness is something that we can experience as an object of intuition. So that means that the absolute nothingness is not something that exists and that we can experience. So it is not something that we can experience. It is always outside of the world. And so we can just be affected by this absolute nothingness through the other people, other persons. So it means this absolute nothingness is not, how to say, something like a substance, or it's just, it gives just a trace. So, and I can notice this absolute nothingness only through how to say the other. So, and so in this sense, it's not something that exists. Yeah, maybe I mistakenly use the term exist because exist is not good for this absolute nothingness, but it is something that retreats itself. And in this way, I think it is a, how to say, way to compare this notion with the Levinas notion of beyond being. And so the term meta-ontological was used by Levinas, and but not by Tanabe. But I think the concept of meta-ontology can be applied to Tanabe's notion of absolute nothingness. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I can follow up with one question. And let me put the question this way. With Tanabe, you said the other is a relative being, just like the I is. With Levinas, this seems to be different because in the face of the other transcends being a relative being, but is already kind of opening the trace or tracing beyond being, and this may lead to a difference I would like to better understand, because what Levinas calls for is to criticize the totality of the I and its world, its empowerment of being, and go beyond this totality towards something he calls the infinite. And how would you relate the infinite to absolute nothingness? Isn't there maybe a difference that might be important to consider, even though there's obviously, and you pointed this out nicely, quite few similarities. Would maybe absolute nothingness be something we should think of in different way than being or pointing beyond being, but rather, I don't know, a critical new understanding, experiencing of being or something? So, but
Yeah.
just take the question: how does the infinite relate to absolute nothingness? Maybe that's the point I'm interested in.
Oh, thank you so much. So I couldn't how to say, touch this topic in my talk, but I would say that the infinite is related to the absolute nothingness. Why? Because for Tanabe, self-criticism is something that we cannot complete. It means the more I criticize myself, the more I have to criticize myself. It means there is a notion which is in Japanese, hongan bokori. I don't know how to translate it into English. It's a self-estimate inside of the self-criticism. So the act of self-criticizing further invites me to criticize myself further, because inside of the action of my self-criticism, I discover that I estimate myself too much. So this is it means if we criticize ourselves, it doesn't mean that we can achieve the self-criticism, but rather we will have more distance to the achievement of the self-criticism. It means here there is a certain infinitization of the task. So we can call it somehow like an infinite task. So because if I try to criticize myself based on my self-power, I cannot end. This is why I have to renounce my own power. So the infinite intervenes in Tanabe's philosophy in this sense. It's not directly the same as Levinas one, but because I cannot how to say, yeah, so in case of limits, we can say that the more I have responsibility to the other, the more I have to have, so that if I assume the responsibility for the other, it doesn't mean that my responsibility will be diminished, but instead it will increase. And the same thing can be said to Tanabe. It means if I try to accomplish my self-criticism, it doesn't diminish my task, but on the contrary, it will increase my task. So in this sense, there's a certain, how to say, relationship between the infinite and the absolute nothingness. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have yet another question right now? I mean, you can still come back to Masumi Nagasaka's talk in further discussion. If there's no more question right now, then I would like to take the chance, and because then we keep to our time schedule, which is nice, and introduce the second speaker. So thank you very much, Nagasaka Masumi, for this nice presentation. And we go on with our second speaker, Professor Ishikawa Motomu. He has been a professor at Tokyo Metropolitan University for the last 3 decades and just retired. Your main research areas comprise Kant's theoretical philosophy and the philosophy of peace. The former, so Kant's theoretical philosophy, aims to re-evaluate Kant's theory of judgment within the context of European philosophical history. And you summarize this in a book called, entitled Kant and the World of Infinite Judgment. Your research on peace is an attempt to re-examine the significance of Kant's theory of eternal peace in light of modern East Asian history. And you published a book on this entitled Kant on the Battlefield, Re-arising Evil and Path to Eternal Peace. The presentation today is entitled Punishment Aims to Eliminate Itself, Human Rule as Ruled by Virtue. Please, welcome, and the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you very much for preparing for this gathering. I have studied German philosophy, especially Immanuel Kant, for quite a long time. And but I am ashamed to say that I am not used to discussing in a foreign language, even in English. So in advance, I will say my presentation will deal with somewhat older Japanese criminal law thought, which is very different from contemporary European thought. In the second half, I will look at the modern history of Japan and China regarding the management of war criminals. So I will now read from my manuscript. Punishment aims to eliminate itself, human rule as ruled by virtue. The title is derived from the Book of Documents, Shujin, one of the ancient Chinese classics. It states, punishment aims at no punishment, so the people align willingly from within. In Japan's Edo period, during the early 18th century, a Confucian scholar wrote Mukeiroku, the records for no punishment, inspired by this passage. It remained obscure, unpublished until more than a century later, in 1877. An annotated edition appeared in 1927, but only a late 20th century reprint brought it to wider attention. I too, just recently, became acquainted of it. The author, Ashino Tozan, was a Confucian scholar from the Sendai domain in northeastern Japan. After studying in Kyoto and Edo, he returned to Sendai, where he established a domain school and proposed reforms, including abolishing status-based seating arrangements. His uncompromising stance angered the authorities, leading to his dismissal and 24 years of house arrest under the order of a rival faction. During his studies in Edo, Tozan's teacher was renowned scholar Muro Kyuso. Kyuso was entrusted by the 8th shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune with compiling and annotating classical texts on punishments and criminal law. This major project, part of the Kyoho reforms to reconstructure administration, aimed to establish a unified Japanese criminal law system, then uncodified. However, as Kyuso was too old to undertake the task, he entrusted it to his young disciple Ashi Tozan. Despite his unjust confinement in Sendai, Tozan undertook the challenge and 1755 completed the Mukeiroku manuscript, which comprises 14 sections in 18 volumes, advancing his vision of human rule. Nevertheless, this manuscript undoubtedly holds global significance. Above all, Mukeiroku can be considered the world's earliest comprehensive treatise on criminal law and penal systems. Many regard Cesare Beccaria's Dei delitti e delle pene on crimes and punishments, 1764, as a seminal classic in this field. Yet, Mukeiroku predates it by a decade. Furthermore, in terms of its content, Mukeiroku develops ideas throughout its pages that would have astonished even Beccaria, the Western pioneer. This is yet another point that makes Mukeiroku internationally valuable. Michel Foucault's Chevalier et Puni, Naissance de la Prison, or Discipline and Punish, the Birth of the Prison, vividly describes the brutal punishments and surveillance systems of 18th century Europe. Against this backdrop, Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishments was groundbreaking, advocating for the humane treatment of prisoners. He proposed that punishment should focus on preventing crime through education rather than retribution, thus laying the groundwork for rehabilitative justice. Yet, Beccaria's ideas, though briefly mentioned in the final section of his work, were remarkably advanced for Europe. Foucault's Discipline and Punish highlights the era's brutal punitive practices, underscoring Beccaria's innovation. Similarly, British reformer John Howard, in his 1784 The State of Prisons, focused on improving prison conditions, but still prioritized punitive measures, reflecting the slower pace of reform in Europe. In stark contrast, Mukeiroku inhabits an entirely different philosophical realm. Tozan firmly believed in the moral validity of rehabilitative justice, tracing its origin to ancient Chinese philosophy from before the Common Era. Citing the ancient Chinese wisdom that water too pure breeds no fish, a millennia-old proverb warning that rigid enforcement of penalties would destroy human society, Tozan argued. People should be guided to correct their mistakes naturally, govern them with tolerance and compassion, carefully considering their circumstances, understanding, anticipating, and emphasizing with their feelings. This is the art of governing people through humanity itself, avoiding harsh interrogation. True reform arises when people reflect voluntarily and seek solutions through their own efforts, achieving governance without oppression. For those who break rules, apply compassionate correction. Even minor offenses should be addressed seriously, recognizing their potential for good and encouraging sincere confession to foster reform and return to virtue. For serious crimes, avoid hasty judgments, thoroughly investigate all circumstances, and use punishment only as a last resort. Only then can benevolent influence inspire their transformation. For those facing capital punishment, show the deepest understanding and always seek alternative to execution. This embodies the virtue of preserving life. In this text, two critical aspects merit particular attention. First, Tozan's strong emphasis on respecting offenders' voluntary confession, prioritizing sincere repentance and the cornerstone of reform. Second, his philosophy of governing humans through humanity itself. We will revisit this concept in our conclusion. Europe did not institutionalize rehabilitative justice until the 19th century, and respect for prisoner autonomy was only tentatively codified in the International Prison Congress Declaration in the United States, 1870. Of course, Tozan could not have known he was far ahead of his time. This is naturally explained by two factors. Externally, he lived as a de facto prisoner. Internally, his worldview was deeply immersed in Chinese classical texts. The Confucian principle of Onko Chishin, reviewing the old to understand the new, was strikingly embodied here. What was ancient in East Asia proved revolutionary on a global scale. Might we assert that modern Western penal practices, rather than Tozan's philosophy, remained bound by punitive justice? Tozan was not an isolated case in Japan. As early as the 18th century, Japan implemented a progressive policy for minor offenders. Rather than banishing them, they were housed in facilities known as Rinsoku Yoseba, correctional workhouses, where they received vocational training and moral education through Confucian-inspired lectures to facilitate their reintegration into society. In 1856, when Tsukudajima in Edo, home to one such facility, was struck by unprecedented storm surge, the local magistrate ordered the emergency release of all inmates. Remarkably, about 70 of stronger prisoners voluntarily remained to protect their compassionate institution from the devastating waves. Moreover, except for those who tragically perished, every prisoner who had evacuated eventually returned. Contemporary accounts describe this incident as a miracle, reflecting the success of Japan's rehabilitative justice. Another compelling case is Yoshida Shoin, a renowned late Edo period intellectual in Japan, executed by the shogunate at the age of 29. Yet his disciple, for better or worse, went on to shape Meiji era. Some critics contend that Shoin's radical exclusionist ideology laid the groundwork for Japan's later expansionist policies in East Asia. But this study focuses instead on a lesser-known aspect of his legacy, his contribution to prison reform. Like Tozan, Shoin firmly believed in rehabilitation through education, a conviction that gained greater credibility through his own prolonged imprisonment. Notably, Shoin lectured fellow inmates on Mencius's philosophy to provide a philosophical foundation for his approach. In a short essay titled Fukudosaku, Fortunate Hole Proposal, Shoin wrote, "The crime lies in the act, not in the person. How can a single act's guilt abruptly negate an individual's potential? For Shoin, all criminals possessed innate goodness, and prisons existed primarily as educational spaces to awaken it. Hence the title, Fortunate Hole." Yet Shoin's Mencian belief in innate goodness evidently failed to resonate with his key disciples. Yamagata Aritomo, whom Shoin had once praised as a great vessel, declared as Home Minister in 1885. Prisons exist for discipline and deterrence, instilling fear in inmates to eradicate criminal intent. Consequently, the Meiji oligarchs, prioritizing Western modernity over Eastern rehabilitative traditions, reverted to punitive justice imported from the West. The Meiji elite willingly embraced regression, proclaiming this misguided trend as civilization and enlightenment, and granting it official legitimacy. In particular, Fukuzawa Yukichi, the self-proclaimed mentor to the Meiji government, led this reactionary turn. An intellectual giant who rejected all Eastern philosophical traditions, Fukuzawa became the mastermind of Japan's modernization. Though Tozan's Mukeiroku was finally published in 1877, as noted earlier, it appeared amid a rapidly changing environment dominated by Westernization. Even the popular edition issued around 1927 faced an increasingly unreceptive intellectual climate. This seminal work, which tirelessly advocated for virtuous governance, essentially compassionate justice, was thus tragically overlooked and forgotten. Indeed, Japan rushed blindly into colonial exploitation and aggressive wars, resulting in enormous damage overseas and culminating in its defeat in 1945. Is humanism truly so fragile? It seems to flicker like a candle in the wind across all eras. Yet, it was the newly founded People's Republic of China, PRC, in 1949 that boldly put humanism into practice through the rehabilitation of Japanese war criminals. Its legal base was merely international law. However, the crucial point here is that law was secondary to the moral imperative. The War Criminal Management Center, established in the city of Fushun, hereafter referred as Fushun, was originally a prison built by the Japanese Empire in the puppet state of Manchukuo. In those days at Fushun, brutal interrogations involving torture were routine. The sick were left untreated, and countless prisoners died due to starvation and inhumane conditions. The new China transformed this infernal prison completely into what Yoshida Shoin might have called a fortunate hole. This was no exaggeration. Even Shoin himself would likely have rejoiced. Approximately 1,000 Japanese war criminals, returning from 5 years of harsh internment in Siberia, were detained in this facility. They received ample food, were freed from forced labor, and provided with the latest and most comprehensive medical care. Most remarkable of all was that PRC authorities strictly prohibited the facility's Chinese staff from using any violence or verbal abuse against these former enemies, men who had once committed horrific crimes under the guise of military operations and who had initially resisted defiantly. In essence, the staff were forbidden from taking on the role of the north wind in Aesop's fable, The North Wind and the Sun, and instead encouraged implicitly to embody the warmth of the sun. What then transpired in the 6 years that followed, and how were the war criminals transformed? In other words, how did they shed the old blood-stained coat of militarist imperialism with its reverence for the emperor as divine? Moreover, how intense were the psychological conflicts faced by both Japanese war criminals and the Chinese staff in achieving that transformation? I addressed these transformations and conflicts nearly 2 decades ago at a workshop during the Asia Regional Conference of the World Peace Forum held in Vancouver, Canada in June 2006. Fortunately, the manuscript remains accessible online. Please refer to it for further details. This transformation is often called miracle of Fushin. I once shared that view, but no longer. Would Yoshida Shoin or Ashi Tozan have deemed it a miracle? For them, would it not have been simply just unexpected? Perhaps calling it a miracle only reveals how far our moral compass has fallen. After all, the specific measures Tozan proposed in Mukeirok, cited earlier, were indeed implemented in Fushin precisely as envisioned, and this has been clearly confirmed by the testimonies of Japanese war criminals upon their return. Shoin argued that Menciu's doctrine of human goodness is not a matter of reasoning, but an a priori truth. This mirrors Aesop's fable, The North Wind and the Sun, where the north wind, despite all its might, cannot prevail over the sun. The sun's goodness, or Mencius' words, the goodness of heaven, is an eternal truth. What then should people do? The answer comes naturally, without deliberation. Thus, Menciu's doctrine of human goodness is not a theory, but an action. In contrast, the claim of human evil, as argued by Sun Tzu, is mere rationalization to explain deviations from the universal moral principle. Tozan spoke of the profound meaning of governing through human virtue, which he called human rule. Today, however, human rule or governance is misconstrued as rule by men, viewed as the antithesis of the rule of law and condemned as a pretext for authoritarianism. For Mencius, however, human rule was meant rule by virtue, urging humanity to emulate the sun's warmth, not the north wind's sheer force. By contrast, the rule of law often adopts a legalist framework, assuming the evil of human nature and enforcing strict laws, much like China's ancient legalists, who could not envision a society without punishment. Meanwhile, rule by virtue, grounded in Menciu's doctrine of human goodness, aims for a world where criminal law becomes obsolete, a society free from punishment and prisons. Perhaps this vision seems too utopian, yet for both Tozan and Shoin, it was no dream. It was a moral horizon towards which humanity must strive. Certainly, even among scholars who praise the achievement of Fushin, some argue that it was merely a desperate diplomatic strategy by the communist government in the 1950s, an attempt to turn even hated Japanese war criminals into allies in order to secure victory over the true invisible enemy. Indeed, this was enacted through top-down orders. Although the Chinese staff were victims themselves, they were compelled to comply with the state mandate. One might reasonably view this achievement as the height of the rule of law, dependent on state intervention. A philosopher like Michel Foucault might argue that such governance represents a perfect example of pure power domination and biopolitics. However, I believe this perspective fails to fully capture the essence of Hushin. In my book, published last summer in Japanese, I argue that key lies not in state-to-state relations, but in person-to-person connections. In other words, morality, not politics, is at stake. While I lack the space to elaborate further here, I will only say this. When I recently encountered Tozan's 300-year-old writings on the significance of human rule, I felt as if I had received a heavenly blessing. Because Tozan, in the Edo period, wrote that in order to make sinners travelers on the road of life to cast off their evil coats voluntarily rather than forcibly, those who govern must embody the heaven's virtue. Hushin unfolded in the 1950s. Many may now view that era as entirely different world compared to today's China. Indeed, the Cultural Revolution storm in the 1960s was a dreadful regression. Unbelievably, former management center officials who had once shown leniency toward Japanese war criminals were now accused of counter-revolutionary crimes and became prisoners themselves, going from the fortunate hole back to actual prison. It took them much longer to have their names restored. Yet, what sustained their spirit was lively updates from the Association of China Returnees, Chukiren, formed by former Japanese soldiers to foster Japan-China friendship and peace, alongside numerous heartfelt letters of gratitude from them directly or indirectly. In the late 1970s, they finally reunited in Japan. The former management center head, his name Jin Yuan, later visited Japan as many as 11 times. Indeed, these exchanges were driven by individuals, not states, through people-to-people interactions. We must reconsider the meaning of human rule or rule by virtue as the original form preceding the rule of law, not as an arbitrary rule opposing it. That's all I have to read. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ishikawa. This has been very interesting. And we do have time for questions and comments.
Nils, maybe, or Motomo-san, maybe you can.
Maybe you and the sharing of your screen.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. That's fine. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Very nice.
Sorry.
Yeah, Veronica, please, you start.
No one has any questions, and I don't want to monopolize, but since no one from the moment, I see that. Okay, so a very short question, because I see that Masumi has also a question. Like at the moment you said that like we could consider human goodness, original goodness, as an axiom, rather than a theory, or it was related to a particular philosopher or thinker. And maybe you could say, I found this very interesting, this idea that it's could be considered as an axiom. Maybe you could say some words more. What would this mean, axiom? Does it mean that we cannot really have a proof of human goodness? Because often we see the contrary through our experience, like human evilness. So would this mean that we have somehow to believe in human goodness? It's a kind of hope in Kantian sense of the word, but without any possible theoretical proof or experiential proof. And then my question would be, why should we believe in human goodness and not rather in human evil? Yeah, that would be my question. Could you understand well my question, Motomo-san?
Yeah. Uh,
Uh,
can we prove the human goodness? Your question is, can we prove that truth?
And if you cannot prove it, then why is this an axiom? Why should we somehow believe if we cannot know such a thing as human goodness, that humans are good originally, yeah? Which is, by the way, a very Rousseauist idea. I don't know whether there has been any contact between like Rousseauist philosophy, because it's, yeah, it reminds me of that.
そうですね。
Maybe you can reply in Japanese, and Masumi or Makoto,
そうです。
they can translate.
すいません。日本語で、いや、確かに公理っていうふうに言ったのは、やっぱ証明することがそもそもできないからという意味で言ったんですよね。ええ。あの、とにかく人間の、性が善なるものであるっていうことが、理論ではなくて、一種の根本的な事実だということを、言いたかったんですね。だからそれはそもそも証明できないような事実なのじゃないかというふうな意味で言いました。ちょっと、お願いします。
Um, so Ishikawa-san said, so that is the original human goodness is not something that can be proven. So, but it's a basic fact, and in that sense, he used the term axiom.
Thank you.
Then, Nagasaka Masumi, you have.
どうぞね。
Thank you, Ishikawa-sensei. I have also a question. Yeah, because you are a very renowned Kant scholar, and of course, Kant is known that he criticized the Beccaria theory, saying that he doesn't distinguish homo phenomenon and homo noumenon, or Beccaria's theory is based on consequentialism. And so I'm struggling to understand Kant's position because, yeah, on death penalty. So what is your thought about this Kant's position, and yeah, how should we interpret Kant's theory of death penalty? Thank you.
これもすいません。勝森さんお願いします。でもこれ、本当に結局あそこで、道徳の形状学ね。で、法論と徳論という二部構成になってますよね。それで結局ね、カントは、法論においてその死刑っていうものをね、肯定して、ベッカリアンを徹底的に批判するわけですよ。で、それはね、結局やっぱり法っていうものを、それ自体主人公に立ててしまって、いや、本来、人間がやっぱり肉体を持って、いるっていうような、そういう、生身の人間だっていうことをちょっと括弧に入れてね、法それ自体を語ってしまってるわけなんですよね。で、しかし、その、後半の徳論においては、やっぱり当然ながら、やっぱりその、肉体を持って、まさに感性を持って、感性と理性を一緒に持ってる生きた人間として、あの、議論をしてるんだけど、そこではやっぱり、僕は基本的に死刑っていうのは、あの、徳論のレベルでは、カントはそれ論じてはいないんだけども、死刑にはおそらくは反対してるんじゃないかというふうに思います。法それ自体を、それは彼のいいところでもあるし悪いところでもあるんだけども、法を一種の まあ言っても主体というか、カント言うとなんていうのかな、主権っていうのは法なんですよね。人間じゃなくて法なんですよね。だからそういう、ところで、その法それ自体っていうものをもう語ってしまうような文脈では、死刑っていうものをね、あの、結局は、こうできてたっていうふうに、そういう議論をしてるんだと思うんです。いや、ちょっとあまり正確な答えではないんだけども、えーいや、答えになった。ごめんなさい。
Thank you so much.
You want to
Should I?
give a
すいま
brief
せん、すいません。
English translation to those who
あ、
do not
お願いします。
understand
すいませ
Japanese?
ん。すいません。
Yeah, should I translate or Katsumori Sensei, will you?
ね。
I I think Masumi-san can translate much
Oh,
better.
okay. No, no, no.
そう
Uh,
です。
yeah, so his explanation was based on the distinction between the theory of laws and theory on virtue in Kant. So in the theory of law, he of course treats the question of death penalty and criticizes harshly Beccaria. But because it was section of law in the metaphysics of morals, so in the section of law, the human is not treated as a sensuous corporeal entity, and in the theory of virtue, actually Kant did not discuss the question of death penalty, but if he uh, uh, treated this question in this section of virtue, he could have raised objection toward death penalty. So this is the opinion of Motomo Ishikawa sensei. And because the law is for Kant distinguished from the human. So law is just it's not a living body. The law is related to, if I borrow the expression of Ishikawa Motomo sensei, it's like a dead body. So it's just a structure, and it doesn't reflect the real human life. Well, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can add a very brief question, and please just give a brief answer because otherwise we're running out of time. Because in Kant, he introduces law particularly in order to secure humans living together and allowing for pure virtue. So for acting according to pure virtue. But we need law in order to because pure virtue goes along with in Kant at least it goes along with autonomy, which is very important. We need law regulating where the autonomy of the one needs to consider the autonomy of the other, and so how do we regulate these and bring these together? And for Mencius, I think for the Confucian tradition, this seems to be different. So there's a like the ruler who's virtuous or who rules according to virtue, to pure morality, is not restricted by law, but knows the best for everyone, which is not true for Kant. So Kant, the basic Kantian claim is respect the autonomy of the other. And for this, you need the law, right? So the law has a crucial, I think at least, maybe you correct me, a crucial function in Kantian social philosophy.
いや、ちょっと。 そうですね。いや、すいません。僕の理解でよければ、あれですね。カントは孔子や孟子とは違って、やっぱり法の哲学者ではなかったかということですよね。そうですね。いや、まさに、まさにそうだと。え、
So he
いや
says,
いやいやいやいや、
oh,
はい。
so it is true that Kant
え、
is a philosopher who focused um, on law, unlike Confucianists.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, then there. Okay, you're saying there's just this is the difference between the two. Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you
I'll,
for.
I'll, I'll, if you uh, if you have any question, please write me email.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
That's very nice. That's very.
I will sure to respond as soon as possible. I think that's the best way for us to communicate.
Thank you very much for this nice suggestion.
I,
That's very good. So anyone who has further questions, please write an email. Thanks a lot, Professor Ishikawa. Okay.
thank you very much.
Nils, just
Yeah.
maybe Motomo-san, maybe you can write
はい。
your email in the chat so that
いやいや、
they can contact you if they have any
Yeah.
questions.
All right. Then it's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker of today, Professor Katsumori Makoto, who is a professor emeritus in philosophy at Akita University. He started his studies in geophysics and then continued with history and philosophy of science at the University of Tokyo. And you received your PhD at the Free Universiteit in Amsterdam with your research interests and the main topics of your research being philosophy of science and contemporary European and Japanese philosophy. And I mentioned amongst your publications, I mentioned just one entitled Questioning Contemporary Japanese Philosophy and Niels Bohr's Complementarity. So please, Professor Katsumori, the floor is yours. And the title of your presentation today is Takahashi's Critique of Goyama's Philosophy of World History.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Thank you.
Very well. Very good. Yeah.
Okay. I have to make a correction of a mistake, my mistake. The last word of the title is not philosophy, but history. So the title should be Takahashi's Critique of Koyama's Philosophy of World History. So this is a kind of introductory survey of this topic, rather than a critical analysis of my own. It's a simple survey. And while Koyama's philosophy of world history is pretty well known in the field, Takahashi's critique of it is not so much widely known, it seems to me. Not so much as it seems to deserve. So I'd like to be more known by more people. And so let me share the screen. Okay. No. Oh, this. Do you see the text?
No.
No.
Mhm.
That's strange.
We see only like the screen with Zoom.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. Just let me try again.
Like the
No.
your text, which we're going to read, should be like the first. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Click on the on this and make it just larger. If you could widen it.
And you
Now it disappeared again.
your screen share. Oh,
Maybe you stop screen sharing and then start it again.
how about this?
Yeah, this works. Yeah, now it's
Okay.
fine.
Thank you. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. So let me more or less read the text as it is. So philosophers, I'll enlarge the text a little bit. Okay. Philosophers' political and ideological engagements in their country's war situation, particularly during World War II, have been a controversial issue in Japan as much as in other countries. In Japan, this issue specifically concerns the wartime discourse of a group of philosophers known as the Kyoto School. After the war, the Kyoto School's wartime discourse was severely criticized by some for supporting Japan's war of aggression, while it was defended by some others who tended to downplay their war complicity. In question here is not so much their personal attitudes or commitments, but rather the ideological roles they played in and through their philosophical work itself, particularly their philosophy of world history. In this presentation, I take up Kyoto School philosopher Koyama Iwao's Philosophy of World History, and a critique of this work by present-day philosopher Takahashi Tetsuya. My focus is on Takahashi's inquiry into how Koyama's anti-imperialist logic paradoxically results in an imperialist philosophy. In the first section, I outline Koyama's philosophy of world history, and in the second section, survey Takahashi's critical analysis of this work. So section 1, Koyama's philosophy of world history. Koyama Iwao's philosophy of world history is the most systematic discourse of philosophical nationalism in wartime Japan. In his 1942 major work, The Philosophy of World History and Related Writings, Koyama seeks to overcome the modern monistic view of world history, which centers on Europe. He rejects this Eurocentric world monism, but not in favor of other kinds of world monism, including naive Japanese expansionism, which seeks to expand the principles of one's particular world continuously into universal principles. Instead, he argues for a new idea of world history that starts from the plurality of historical worlds. From this point of view, Koyama introduces the concept of particular world history, 特殊的世界史, as distinct from universal world history. In terms of this conceptual distinction, world monism may be characterized as the naive dogmatism that simply holds one's particular world history to be universal world history. As Koyama acknowledges, modern world history has largely been a world history of the European world, marked by Europe's global expansion in the form of imperialist colonization. However, world history is currently undergoing a major transformation in which Eurocentric world history is about to break down. In Koyama's view, this current change is occasioned by the following two factors deriving from modern world history itself. First, Europe's global expansion has paradoxically brought about Europe's increasing dependence on its outside. Second, there has arisen the tendency for the non-European world, particularly East Asia, to resist European world domination. This tendency is based on the possibility that non-European countries can also introduce modern European culture and centering on technology and science, and thereby more or less modernize themselves. For this reason, the tendency to resist Europe's world domination is led by Japan, which has most effectively modernized itself by transplanting European culture into itself. By virtue of its strong spiritual autonomy, Japan has been all the more able freely to assimilate European culture and is thus most capable of the negation of the European world hegemony. According to Koyama, the current world war may also be situated in this world historical context. Unlike the First World War, the Second World War, especially its part known as the Greater East Asian War, is not a war inside modernity, but a war that goes beyond the modern world. While World War I was a result of the imperialist struggle between European powers, World War II is a struggle against this imperialism as the unequal power system resulting from the modern European principle of liberalism. driven by vigorous moral energy or a spiritual vitality. The present world war is striving to replace Europe's imperialist world domination with a new world order based on a new moral principle. In this context, Koyama attaches special importance to the notion of the particular world. In his view, under the current world situation, states can no longer subsist without going beyond the hitherto existing confines of their territory to form particular worlds, commonly called co-prosperity spheres. The particular world is not a state, nor an empire in its modern sense, but is an organization that has a close political unity resting on racial, ethnic, and cultural affinity. This organization is formed under the leadership of a certain state and requires a qualitative division of sovereignty and its distributive reorganization. Most importantly, continues Koyama, the particular world is constructed not by free contract, nor by coercive force, but rather based on a new moral principle as advocated by Japan. The principle that, quote, each ethnic group and each state take their right place. The current Greater East Asia War is precisely an endeavor led by Japan to construct this kind of particular world, or the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In Koyama's view, the above moral principle for a new world order may be called a Japanese principle because it is not only advocated by Japan, but also it resides in Japan. This principle is particularly embodied in Japan's national polity, centering on the emperor system, in which there is a profound unity at the basis of differences, or in other words, the one and the many interpenetrate. Based on this moral world principle, ethnic groups and states will each take their right place and achieve their true co-prosperity. Section 2, Takahashi's critical reading of Koyama. Having so far roughly outlined Koyama's philosophy of world history, let's now look at Takahashi Tetsuya's critique of this work. Takahashi is a contemporary Japanese philosopher who, inspired by Derridian deconstruction, has developed a number of philosophical and social critical studies on issues such as war, responsibility, nationalism, and so on. He offers an in-depth deconstructive critique of Koyama's work in a chapter of his 1995 book, The Ethics of Memory, Kyoku no Echika. Takahashi starts by tracing Koyama's account of world history with a focus on the problem of the transmission and transplantation of culture. In Koyama's view, culture can be transmitted and transplanted from one place to another, and this is a major characteristic of culture itself. The current decline of Europe, or the current breakdown of the Eurocentric world order, is rooted in the very transmissivity of culture, which have hitherto sustained the hegemony of Europe. Understanding this logic of transmissivity and transplantability along the lines of Jacques Derrida's notions of dissemination and iterability, Takahashi suggests that this logic will ultimately lead to the impossibility of properness of any culture, so that no ethnic group and no particular world can absolutely appropriate a certain culture. However, as Takahashi points out, Koyama puts certain arbitrary brakes on the possibility of transplanting culture. If specifically we recognize that Japan's national polity is also essentially transmittable and transplantable, then its original link to a specific region and a specific ethnicity will be lost, and the notion of the absolute properness of the national polity will break down. Therefore, Koyama cannot but introduce such a notion as the unchanging national polity that transcends the changes of the government system. Japan's national spirit, centering on the imperial household, constitutes the immovable center of Japanese culture, and this represents our country's uniqueness unshared by other nations. In this way, emphasizes Takahashi, by positing Japan's invariable national polity and national spirit, Koyama runs counter to his own viewpoint of the transplantability and transmissivity of culture. As Takahashi suggests, this self-contradictory discourse of Koyama is driven by the desire to found Japan's world historical role on the originality of its national spirit and national polity. Takahashi is careful to note, however, that Koyama does not simply subscribe to a naive or dogmatic Japan-centrism. He reminds us that Koyama criticizes not only Eurocentrism, but also the Japan-centric tendency to envisage a naive, continuous expansion of Japan into the world. Is Takahashi here trying to downplay or neutralize the imperialist orientation of Koyama's thought? By no means. For Takahashi, there can be no doubt that Koyama's philosophy of world history is an imperialist philosophy that served to justify Japan's imperialist war of aggression. Rather, he poses this paradoxical question: how does Koyama's anti-imperialist logic nevertheless result in an imperialist philosophy? I skip to the next paragraph. As we have seen, highlighting the new moral principle that each ethnic group and each state take their own right place, Koyama characterizes his pluralist anti-imperialist principle as a Japanese principle, as embodied in Japanese national polity. Here, Takahashi crucially points out that while maintaining pluralism, Koyama's philosophical nationalism affirms itself on the meta level. That is, it appropriates pluralism itself, the transcendental principle of the contemporary world, as Japan's own proper principle. For Koyama, continues Takahashi, Japan's national polity is a transcendental truth that serves as a world principle. So his philosophy of world history inscribes the transcendental truth in Japan's empirical body and, quote, appropriates the principle of the interpenetration of one and many as Japan's own proper and authentic tradition. This is how his anti-imperialist logic paradoxically results in an imperialist philosophy on the meta level or transcendental level. Takahashi characterizes this discourse of Koyama as a typical case of the logic of exemplarity or exemplarist nationalism, in which philosophical universalism and nationalism are inseparably connected. As critically analyzed by Derrida, exemplarist nationalism has been repeated again and again by many authors of nationalist discourse. In this way, according to Takahashi, Koyama's philosophical nationalism, while speaking of respecting others, in fact, has this telos of subsuming all others within the self, in this case, the national self, and thus proves to be imperialist as logic. Takahashi further suggests, however, that this imperialism does not limit itself to the purely logical or transcendental dimension. I skipped one sentence. Rather, it seeks to justify also on the empirical and factual level Japan's imperialist action is Greater East Asia War. Justify Japan's imperialist action is Greater East Asia War. This is because, quote, there's no pure meta level or transcendental level in history, unquote, but the history of transcendental truth can only appear can only appear as the meaning of factual history. In fact, as we have seen, Koyama develops his idea of the particular world, which requires a qualitative division of sovereignty and its distributive reorganization in such a way as to found and theoretically justify the Great East Asia co-prosperity sphere. For Koyama, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere is nothing other than a particular world whose member states' sovereignty is divided and limited by Japan and for Japan's leadership. In this way, Takahashi concludes not only on the meta level, but also on the factual level. Koyama's philosophy of world history proves to be an imperialist philosophy that endorses and legitimizes Japan's actual imperialist policy and war of aggression. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Professor Katsumori. This has been very interesting and I think, again, very clear. And we do have at least 10, maybe a few more minutes for comments, questions, discussion. I mean, maybe a very obvious question, and maybe it's not, is what Takahashi comments on Koyama's interpretation, saying that, well, a particular Japanese view is taken to be universal, and therefore the imperialism is somehow justified as being non-imperialist, but rather multi-centered or something. It could be raised against European imperialism and probably against many other forms of historical imperialism as well, right? So the Takahashi's critique somehow is not peculiar to the Japanese situation.
Thank you. That's perfectly correct. In Takahashi's understanding, what he calls exemplary the logic of exemplarity or exemplarist nationalism is not limited to Japan, the Japanese scholars like Koyama, but also very commonly seen practically most forms of nationalism in the modern times take this stance of exemplarist nationalism. And he mentions Derrida in his work. And Derrida, for example, made a critical analysis of this form of the logic of exemplarity, including exemplarist nationalism. In the case of the neo-Kantian Hermann Cohen, for example.
Thank
So,
you. Yeah, thank you. Professor Katsumura, maybe you can stop sharing your screen because
I'm sorry.
then it's easier to see one another. And next question is by Nagasaka Mazumi.
Thank you, Katsumari-sensei, for this wonderful conference. And I would like to raise two questions. So the first one is the notion of the philosophy of world history actually reminds us the Hegel's lecture on philosophy, history of world philosophy. And I was wondering if, because I have no knowledge about Iwao Koyama, if he's referring to Hegel in this work. And the second question is maybe related to the last question. So, when we try to, criticizes domination, for instance, European domination or European centrism, it can introduce another domination. So it can end up with introducing another imperialism. Or, so it's not only maybe Koyama, but also in any criticism we have such tendency. And how can we introduce a criticism of domination of Europe or something without introducing another domination or another power? So that would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. And the first question is about whether Koyama mentioned Hegel's philosophy of history in his work. He mentions Hegel from time to time, and so he's very well versed in modern European philosophy, including Hegel. But I don't quite remember. He talked about Hegel's philosophy of science, philosophy of history here. I'm sorry. I'll look at it. The other question is whether I'm sorry, I lost the screen. Okay. The other, your second question is whether it is possible to go to another form of imperialism while criticizing European or existing imperialism. So according to Takahashi, you mean?
I mean, not only imperialism, but how to say, we try to criticize European centrism or domination,
European centrism,
domination
yeah.
of the world.
Mhm.
We tend to, how to say, introduce another particular domination as Koyama did, and without being introduced another domination, how can we criticize a certain domination that exists now? Yeah, so this is question.
So for Takahashi, as far as Takahashi sees, there's no answer to that in the Kyoto school, in Koyama's work or in the Kyoto school. So and Takahashi, he wants to think that way, and he's trying to find a way to to criticize existing Eurocentrism or other forms of centrism without creating another form of centrism. But in his work, at least, he does not offer an answer to that question. So I think we should look at his look at other works of Takahashi, and which maybe he's making some suggestions.
Thank you. Maybe we already have to come to the last question. Veronica, your turn, please.
Nils, I can also ask the question in private to Makoto, because
No. Go ahead. That's fine. Yeah. We still have the time. That's fine.
Thank you, first, Makoto. It was really very interesting. I was wondering, does Takahashi engage with decolonial and post-colonial thinkers, or maybe, other Japanese philosophers who have a similar critique of imperialism, European Japanese? Because this is the thread, the big motive of decolonial and post-colonial philosophies. And on the other hand, would you characterize Takahashi's philosophy as a form of decolonial or post-colonial philosophy?
Thank you. Maybe in a broad sense, only he, as far as I remember, or as far as I know, he doesn't, or he never characterized his work as post-colonial or in such terms. Rather, he always acknowledges his debt to Jacques Derrida, Derridan deconstruction. It's he acknowledges he has been greatly influenced by Derrida, but he doesn't mention post-colonialism itself. So, but in a broad sense, I don't think it's incorrect to say so.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, it's already 2 o'clock. This has been a very interesting and I think in the best sense, if you will, thought-provoking workshop with 3 presentations. Thank you, Nagasaka Mazumi. Thank you, Ishikawa Motomu, and thank you, Katsumori Makoto, for your papers and for everyone for discussion. And I think the last word probably has Veronica, who's organized this. Please, Veronica.
I think you said already everything, Nils. So it was really very interesting, insightful. So thank you to all the speakers for your time, your preparation, interesting talks, and thank you also to you, Nils, for moderating and for supporting the initiative. And I hope that we could further exchange on this topic through emails. And I also encourage the participants to contact the speakers if they still have any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thanks a
much.
lot. Then goodbye.
Bye.
Good
Bye.
evening in Japan.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon in Europe.